I've been reading and thinking about John Wyndham and his novels. Recently, I had given to me a series of Amazing Stories magazines from the early 60s. In the June 1964 magazine, there is a profile of John Wyndham. This profile is by Sam Moskowitz. It is an 11-page profile. I think Amy Binns used that profile as part of her sources for Hidden Wyndham, Life, Love, and Letters, published in 2019. John Wyndham was born in 1903. He was of school age and narrowly missed being part of World War I. After bouncing around to a few jobs, he tried his hand at writing. He was able to publish some science fiction short stories. He also tried his hand at novels, and in 1935, he published his first novel, Foul Play Suspected, a detective novel. After almost 80 years, Modern Library has reissued Foul Play Suspected, and you can read it yourself. Then he published some science fiction novels. Cornet Books in the 70s reissued these: The Secret People and Stowaway to Mars. This was originally published as The Planet Plane. And Modern Library has reissued this one as well. Cornet also gathered collections of his early science fiction stories, Sleepers of Mars and Wanderers of Time. John Wyndham's career was taking off. And then World War II. Hitler invaded Poland. Britain and France were fighting for their very existence. Reading from the profile in Amazing Stories. Civil liberties taken for granted during peacetime were restricted. Wyndham found himself working in the civil service in censorship from August 1940 to November 1943. He was participating in the curtailment of those civil liberties. Then, at the age of 40, he found himself a corporal with the Royal Signal Corps, working as a cipher operator. He next was deposited on the beaches of Normandy. I can only imagine the horrors he saw there and in France as they worked to drive back the Germans. During the entire war period, he only published one story, The Phony Meteor. It told of a tiny spaceship mistaken first for a Nazi secret weapon and then for a meteor. All its passengers, minute bug-like creatures sent to establish a colony on Earth, are destroyed by insect spray without the slightest realization of what they really are. Wyndham is discharged in 1946. He wants to resume his writing career. He finds it difficult. His financial resources are limited. He goes back to an idea from a short story he published early in the 1930s. It's a biological story about puffballs and their menace. He starts thinking about biological engineering of plants. At that time, there are rumors of biological engineering in Russia to improve the yield of crops. Wyndham takes these ideas and starts working on The Day of the Triffids. As he writes the novel, he becomes stuck with the conclusion and withholds its publication. He puts it aside and writes a second novel, Plan for Chaos. Wyndham was writing Plan for Chaos in particular for the American audience. He submitted it for publication and it was rejected. In 2010, the first mass market edition of Plan for Chaos was published by Penguin. Modern Library Classics has an audiobook of it as well. From the back of the book. Written at the same time as The Day of the Triffids, the completed manuscript of Plan for Chaos was seen by only a handful of people before Wyndham abandoned it, unpublished, and overshadowed by its companion's sudden and phenomenal success. It has remained unpublished for some 40 years since John Wyndham's death. And their blurb? In a city much like New York, a series of identical women are found dead in suspicious circumstances. Magazine photographer Johnny Farthing, who is reporting on the suspected murders, is chilled to discover that his fiancée looks identical to the victims too, and then she disappears. As his investigations spiral beyond his control, he finds himself at the heart of a sinister plot that uses cloning to revive the Nazi vision of a world-powerful master race. Part detective noir, part dystopic thriller, Plan for Chaos reveals the legendary science fiction novelist grappling with some of his most urgent and personal themes. The best part of this book is the introduction by Christopher Priest. The rest of it is a mess. The reader is not surprised it was unpublished. It is interesting to note that 30 years later, Ira Levine wrote The Boys from Brazil. There are definitely a few ideas that are shared between these two books. The idea of cloning and identical upbringing are shared by these two novels. However, The Boys from Brazil is a much better novel. There's even a half-decent movie made from it. There will be no movie for Plan for Chaos. I found this book very difficult to read, even though I love John Wyndham. I would give it 3 out of 10. Thankfully, John Wyndham returned to The Day of the Triffids and completed it and submitted it for publication. It became his most successful novel and launched a new writing career at the age of 48. I first came across The Day of the Triffids in school. It was the first science fiction book that was assigned for reading in English. Now, I was a fan of Star Trek, UFO, Space 1999, and had read some of the novelizations of those TV series. So I was excited to read an actual science fiction book for English. The Day of the Triffids, John Wyndham, 1951. This is the livery of the edition that I read in grade 9. It is a Crest book imprint for Fawcett Publications. This one says, "This is hailed as the greatest science fiction masterpiece of our time." In the United States, the first paperback edition changed the title to Revolt of the Triffids. A most unusual science fiction novel. It was published by Popular Library. Lovers in a Doomed World. Let me just read the blurb from the back of this. For months, the Triffids, hideous walking plants whose sting brought quick death, had terrorized the earth. Suddenly, a new disaster struck as millions were blinded by a blaze of green lights in the sky. In the ensuing chaos, the Triffids went berserk, killing at will. Among the survivors who retained their sight were Bill Mason and Josella Playton. They were lovers caught between the heaven of their frenzied lovemaking and the hell of fighting the Triffids. Only time would tell if they would survive or perish in the shambles of a world gone mad. An exciting and unusual science fiction novel. Well, I can tell you from reading this in grade 9 in school, there wasn't any frenzied lovemaking, but there was very interesting conflict created in a dystopic world. Modern Library has also published The Day of the Triffids. Stephen King says, "The best writer of science fiction that England has ever produced." I don't know about that. I think H.G. Wells is definitely in that conversation. There are 2 events which form the crisis that creates a dystopic world. 1. Russia has developed a plant for its oil, but this plant is something of a monster. When a plane transporting seeds of this plant crashes, the seeds are scattered to the wind. Once full grown, it can actually remove its roots from the soil and shuffle on them. It has a tendril with a stinger on it, and it can sting animals and people. This stinger has poison. As their prey dies at their roots, the Triffids wait for it to rot, and then they feed on the flesh. Triffids are growing up now all over the world as these seeds have been carried by the wind. It takes a while for them to get to maturity, and they are an oddity that gardeners love. Once the danger is known, they're easily kept within fences. The second crisis that occurs is there's a phenomenon of green lights in the sky. These green lights look like falling stars, but they light up the entire sky. Are they an astronomical phenomenon? We don't know for sure, but there is speculation about the satellites that have been put up into the sky. Could they have weapons and power plants that could do something like this? The result of this light display is that everybody who looked up is blinded. The next morning, the world is falling apart. Our protagonist, Bill Mason, as a young man, was stung by an immature Triffid. He has grown to have some immunity to their poison. He becomes a biologist and works with Triffids. He's been hospitalized with an eye injury. The night before his bandages are to be removed, we have this green light display in the sky. The next day is a Wednesday, but he cannot hear the hustle and bustle of London. He wakes up to a world falling apart. And eventually, the Triffids start to take advantage of a prey without sight. So many of the tropes that you see in zombie movies and books, you see here for the first time in The Day of the Triffids. But in fact, we need to think about John Wyndham's war experience. Think of the bombing of London. Think about Dunkirk, and then the beaches of Normandy. Think about the ruin of France. John Wyndham experienced this all. In my reading The Day of the Triffids, I think this is John Wyndham dealing with the aftermath of World War II. Can society recover? Is there anything left to hope for? John Wyndham looks at the psychological and sociological impacts of a society falling apart. The two main characters take a walk to the beach. Josella says, "Don't you still feel sometimes that if you were to close your eyes for a bit, you might open them again to find it all as it was?" I would think some of the people coming through World War II would feel the same way. John Wyndham also speculates about the tightrope of technology. He postulates that the world is one wrong step from falling apart. It could be spy and military satellites blinding people, or it could be biologic in nature, or it could be a plague. Technology is a tightrope. The Day of the Triffids is one of the best known English science fiction novels. It has been adapted into movies and TV series, but you owe it to yourself to go to the source material. It is also a ripping good story. I give The Day of the Triffids 9 out of 10. So have you read Day of the Triffids? How about John Wyndham books? What is your favorite story? Be sure to join the conversation below. I'd love to hear what you think. Subscribe so you don't miss a video. Until next time, keep reading.